Hello everyone. On today's tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at tuning suspension in Homebrew. There have been an enormous amount of misconceptions about this, as well as some general misunderstandings slash confusion. So hopefully I can help everybody out with that. But before we go ahead and get started, let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. First off, we're going to talk about the importance of weight distribution. It's very important. We're going to talk about all the individual settings on a given tire, where to start, how to tune, if you add aerodynamic devices, what if you want to change the dynamics, what if you're using a controller, and of course, getting a little fancy for those of you who are so inclined. So first of all, I have my super duper ultra basic daily driver vehicle sitting right here. It looks ridiculous, but it serves my purpose perfectly for what we're trying to do today. It might seem to have kind of an unusual weight to it, but it's actually based on a real world car, and I actually had to add a little bit of weight using these big old batteries here on the bottom to do it. One unique thing about this particular vehicle is it actually uses a gasoline electric motor configuration. I'm actually using the electric motor as a generator that powers an e-power motor that actually drives the wheels. The reason I chose to do this particular reason is because it gives you constant torque up to about 6,000 RPM, which is really, really great, especially when you're testing things out. It's an excellent configuration. Naturally, I could go with an e-motor that is an infinite battery, but I think people need to get away from using infinite anythings because it's not very realistic, and you've eliminated a really, really big piece of challenge here. So anyway, let's go ahead and take a look. So this particular vehicle is all-wheel drive. I could go with a rear-wheel drive or a front-wheel drive. A front-wheel drive vehicle generally has the advantage that you're pulling yourself as opposed to pushing yourself, so you're going to have a little bit more understeer when you're on the power. It's going to be a little bit tougher to turn sometimes, but at the same token is you're less likely to spin out. Going rear-wheel drive, of course, means your front tires that are doing all the steering now aren't burdened with having to accelerate also, so it actually helps you go forward a bit. But you run into power oversteer problems. I chose to go with all-wheel drive. The disadvantage here is since you're distributing all the torque equally without a fancy differential, you're going to find that you're going to be losing just a little bit of force here. Now, one thing I want to point out too is people often say, well, a little bit of wheel spin is a good thing, and it helps you get accelerating and all that other good stuff. Or people will say no wheel spin is a good thing because that simply means you're having more traction, so you're going to get better acceleration. The reality is a little bit more complicated. What you're taking a look at right here is the actual graphs used in Homebrew for the calculation of the traction that you're probably familiar with. These are real-world tractions, and they're exactly what you want to see as far as people want to probably imagine what they really, really wanted to know. So if you actually take a look down here, you'll notice that the more a tire slips to a point, the more traction you get, up until about 15% slip, and then your traction actually starts to die down. So that's something that kind of surprises people. You can actually see that a lot more clearly over on this graph right here. So you have to kind of watch out for that. We want a little bit of slip, but not too much when accelerating. Anyway, that's besides the point. We're talking about suspension. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to concentrate on right at this particular point is the fact that our center of gravity should be somewhere between the two sets of wheels that are driving a given vehicle. In this particular case, it's kind of hard to estimate where that is. So one trick that I found is to actually spawn in a straight pipe, take that pipe, connect it to your front wheel, and then go ahead and drag it out to where your back wheel is. So that tells me I have a 301 centimeter wheel base. So with that in mind, I can then take this, back it up, right to the point where the center of gravity is. In this particular point, it looks like it's right about 131 centimeters. So I'm going to go scoot over to this handy dandy little spreadsheet I started putting together here. And I've already dialed those factors in. That would tell me that if my vehicle length is 300, or wheelbase is 300, my center of gravity from the front is 131. If I take 1 minus the division of the center of gravity from the front divided by the total length, the length from the front to the center of gravity divided by the total wheelbase, and go ahead and calculate that real quickly, that tells me that 56% of my weight is on the front tires. So that is going to be a front bias, which means my front wheels are always going to grab a little bit better than my back tires are, which can mean a bunch of different things depending on how we tune the rest of the vehicle. So keep that in mind. If we were to skid right this moment with a perfectly balanced traction between the front and the rear, we'd actually want to skid with the back end out because it would have a lot less traction. So that's something to think about as we start designing the rest of our little get up right here. Okay, so the next thing. We'll go fly over to our wheels real fast, and you can take a look at right now, they're basically set to the default value. We have a suspension force of 5,000, we have a damping of 1,000. But what exactly do those variables actually mean? Scooting back here real quick. Spring force equals, it's the force put on the spring by taking the distance that the spring traveled and multiplying it by this force constant. Suspension damping, on the flip side, is taking -1, obviously, because you're going to be acting in the opposite direction of the velocity, times how fast the spring is moving, multiplied by this constant here. Damping actually works opposite of suspension force based on the speed that it is traveling at a given time. Forward friction, you're familiar with that. Sideways friction, you're familiar with that. And of course, brake force is how much torque you provide to actually slow the vehicle down. It's actually torque in the opposite direction of the rotation of the wheel. So keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and take this vehicle into the world real quick. And we're just going to take a quick look and kind of get a feel for just how this handles. There we are. Go ahead and bring it in. Okay. So a couple things we're interested in. First of all is I'm looking at my front tire and I can see it pushing itself up through. By the way, I use a suspension distance of 0.4 as opposed to the default 0.2 because a suspension that has room to move generally works better. One thing I just noticed is we bottomed out, and I'm also noticing the general handling is kind of wandering just a little bit. You can tell that my front wheels have more traction than my back wheels because of the fact that I'm sliding so much here. But if you remember a minute ago when we looked at weight distribution, we realized we have more traction in the front just because there's more weight in the front holding the nose of the vehicle down. Obviously, we could take our back wheels and push them back further or something crazy like that, or bring them closer to the front to eliminate that. But generally, I just use ballast to do that. So right now, this vehicle is handling fairly well. It's definitely kind of wandering. It's definitely kind of bottoming out. Keep in mind, when operating on sand, you have dramatically less traction than you do when you're operating on asphalt. So that is something we're going to have to consider. Whoa, going for a swim. Whee! Okay. Let's scoot back to the builder real quick. And let's see if we can start tuning. Okay. So basically what you want to do to get started is you want to take your vehicle's mass, multiply that by gravity, and then divide it by the number of wheels. This is assuming, of course, your weight distribution is perfect. Remember, 56% of our weight is on the front 2 wheels, and only 44% of the weight is on the back 2 wheels. But if it were perfectly balanced, that would mean that each wheel is being held down with a force of 2,903.76 newtons. So that seems to be an interesting starting point. Let's see what happens. So if we use exactly the amount of force that gravity is holding us down with, 0.3, we'll just use 2903. Watch what happens when we get to the world. Okay, now that's interesting. Now notice the front is lifted down and the back is up a little bit. That has to do with that weight distribution I was warning about a minute ago. The problem is even though our spring has got the ability to actually lift our car off the ground, it's not doing a terribly good job of it. And now the whole vehicle is just kind of whoa and be wandering around. The ironic thing here is that we actually have a tremendous amount of traction because of how far our spring is able to compress. Unfortunately, handling-wise, this is going to be absolute garbage. So what do? I found as a general rule of thumb to go ahead and if you want a generic soft suspension, to multiply that force you just calculated by 2. If you want kind of a soft suspension without going too crazy, multiply it by 4. If you want kind of your average quasi-racing, street racing sort of suspension, multiply that value by 6. Now, if you want a really stiff suspension, we'll talk about the importance of that in a minute, multiply by 15. If you want what I like to call the race car twitch, or an extremely tight suspension, multiply by 26. These values aren't coming out of thin air. They're actually carefully calculated based on the natural harmonic frequency of your suspension based on your weight. Now, one thing I put down here is I always assume a distance of 0.4 on the suspension. Don't use 0.2. Your suspension needs to be able to move to work. Now, what about damping? With damping, I usually like to take 20% of my spring force So in this particular case, my too soft suspension would be 1161. Let's actually go try this value real quick. So we want 5807, and our other value was 1161. All right, whoops, I just did that for a single tire. That's just embarrassing. Awesome. All right, let's go try that. So now this would represent what I like to call the grandparents' car kind of a suspension. It's going to be very loose. It's going to be very, very smooth over the bumps. You know, it's not going to disrupt the direction the vehicle is traveling too much. This tends to be pretty good if you are, making an armored vehicle and you want a very, very easy to fire from firing platform. Notice that we're pretty darn close to sticking out the top, so I know as I'm driving this, we're going to do that. So how is it feeling right now? The acceleration right there was very, very smooth. The steering is pretty good. It's settling fairly quickly as I go around a corner, but now I'm starting to notice a little bit of oversteer. Where's this oversteer coming from? If you remember a little earlier, we don't have as much weight on those back tires. So as a result, when we compress the front, especially under braking, I have so much extra traction that I'm able to actually overwhelm the traction on the back two tires. And that's what's causing that really, really gentle oversteer. One thing you will notice though is I have a lot of traction. And this vehicle is very, very easily able to get over these bumps without disturbing where I'm pointing too much. The braking, you also notice, is extremely good. And this is the general advantage to a soft suspension. I'm going to go ahead and jam on the brakes here. I'm pretty happy with that. You can see a pretty good amount of dive. We're poking out the top a little bit, but we also have gigantic tires for some reason, so oh well. All right, let's go back to the builder. Now let's try a hard suspension. We'll do 43,556. Again, that's by taking your normal weight to wheel and multiplying by 15. 43,556. Let's open the last project. Hit this real quick. And our damping, again, 20% of that is 8711. Now, once you start getting past what I consider to be an average stiffness suspension, you start to enter the area of why would you do this? Because you're intentionally losing traction. Well, the reason why you go with super duper stiff suspensions is because you intend on using downforce. Now, a soft suspension, if you were to apply any sufficient amount of downforce to it, would simply cause it to crush and bottom out, which isn't actually providing you much suspension at all. What you'll notice at this level of stiffness is that the vehicle is basically glued to the ground, and it's very, very difficult to steer. It's become difficult to steer because of the fact that the suspension isn't compressing enough to give me that extra bit of force that allows me to actually steer and or handle. The advantage, of course, to a suspension this stiff is it's extremely responsive. You can see over there on the right that we're just kind of cruising along here. Nice and hard on the brakes. Good control. So if you're trying to create a race car-like simulation, this is an awesome thing to do. Now the best way, believe it or not, to utilize a suspension greater than, as I call, average, is to use downforce, to actually compress the suspension as you're getting faster. A warning on downforce. If I were to stick a giant spring in the, or I should say a giant spoiler in the back and not in the front, as I accelerate, I will start to get understeer because the back end will actually be gripping better than the tires are able to turn me in the front. So what you have to do is you have to either balance the downforce or set the downforce up in a way that this has slightly less downforce in the front than the back, or slightly more in order to control it. Keep in mind, if you get really bad understeer at low speeds and you have a spoiler in the front, at high speeds you're going to get terrible oversteer because your front wheels are going to be the only things actually gripping the ground. All right, let's go ahead and throw these suckers on. These often work best when they're right over the tire that you're operating on. So I'm going to go ahead and just put one in the back. Now watch what's going to happen when I get back to the world. So when we accelerate, we can expect that the faster we go, the worse the understeer is going to get because only the back end of the vehicle is being held down. One thing we have going for us, though, is the fact we have a very stiff suspension, which is actually going to compress more as we accelerate. I'm already noticing my speed here has come down very considerably. Now notice when I turn, it's a very, very, very smooth turn with no under and no oversteer. We've basically just found the magic speed that spoiler is going to grant us so that we have a pretty even balance between under and oversteer. The problem is, as I start getting really fast, which I won't be able to because of all that extra drag in the back seat right now, is I'll lose the, oh, tree! I'll lose the ability to actually steer. So I'm definitely going to have to bring a little bit in the front as well. Yeah, this isn't too bad. And I'm sure when we stand on the brakes this time, we'll stop pretty quickly. Yeah, it's pretty good. If I were to have gone with a softer suspension and that big spoiler in the back, I would have bottomed out more, which actually removes the springiness of said suspension. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to open that last project, and we're going to go ahead and put that same exact spoiler up in the front seat as well. So what's going to happen is, since our downforce is even between the two parts of the car, we're going to have identical handling at both high speed and low speed, which is something you may want. It might be something you don't want. That's going to be something you're going to have to consider, but at the very least, you're thinking about it now. It's going to look absolutely hideous, but I'm not really known for pretty things. I'm known for things that work great. Go ahead and drop that right there. Make sure it's in the center, which it is not. No, it was. Okay. Now watch this. That slight oversteer tendency that we had at low speed, you're going to see is going to reproduce itself at high speed, since the amount of traction is actually equal between the front and the rear of the car. How weird is that? Go ahead and dive in. Let's take this thing for a spin. There's our nice bumpies. You'll notice the bumpies are going to start going away as we go faster, because now the suspension has actually got enough pressure on it to start doing its job. Yeah, now it starts to feel like you're operating on rails. This is sweet. Of course, our top speed has been severely curtailed here. Notice when I hit that little bump back there that nothing bad happened. Oh, this is really nice. Notice when we went over that little dip right there as well, we didn't really fly because there's something holding down the front and the back of our vehicle simultaneously. You don't have to use that big spoiler, by the way, to achieve this effect. But the good news is, look at just how nice and easy this vehicle is now handling. Give it just a little bit of brake, a little bit of acceleration. Had we not set up our suspension originally, we would have had a lot tougher time with this. Now, of course, if I just go ahead and delete the back spoiler, we'll get oversteer all over the place, which is fun if you're the kind of person who likes that. Which brings us to our final value that we're going to be looking at today. I'm actually going to leave the suspension in configuration like that right now. Let's go over to the builder. Open the last project. This time what I'm going to do is I'm going to mess with the value I hate to mess with the most, which is our forward or our sideways traction. Forward traction right now is great. I don't think I need any more because the vehicle is accelerating without spinning its tires, so I'm not too concerned. So now what we want to do is we want to play with the sideways friction. If I were to increase this evenly to both the front and the rear, our vehicle would handle pretty much the way it is before. But I'm actually going to make things a little more interesting. I'm going to take the front two, and I'm going to leave the sideways friction alone. Take the back two and reduce it just a teeny tiny bit to 2.45. That doesn't seem like a very large change. It's about 0.04% or something like that, 5%. I forget exactly what it works out to be. But watch what happens now that the front tires can grab the ground better than the rear tires as we're going around. Keep in mind we have a balanced aerodynamic setup right now, so that is not going to be contributing to the factor you guys are going to be seeing in just a second. Oh man, I need a bigger engine in this thing. 165 horsepower just ain't going to do it. Of course, keep in mind I could have gone with just e-motors and really made this thing a ripper. Okay, now notice my turn-in has improved a little bit. I'm steering just a little bit better coming out of those particular corners. Of course, with that spoiler working as hard as it is, we're not having too much trouble. Yeah, we're pretty stiff right now. I don't feel the thing coming very loose. So we have a very, very well-balanced car at the moment. I'm actually kind of impressed. So we're going to exaggerate the effect just a little bit so that you guys can see it. Whoop. Sorry, Mr. Car. Whoops. Apparently can't do that while you're in a seat. Oh well. Okay. So now I'm going to reduce the back traction to 2.4. Now notice I'm not increasing, because personally you don't really need, between you and me, I don't really feel the need to jack that value up that high. Some people crank that up to 5 as a way to, kind of solve other problems, but it's not very realistic at the same time as you're trying to solve a problem the wrong kind of a way. Anyway, let's get going. Now what you're going to start to notice, actually this is still pretty stable. I'm actually kind of impressed. That is the definite advantage of Downforce, is that those two wings are working very hard right now to keep us down on that ground. And it's actually giving us really good performance. I'm actually slightly impressed. So what we're going to have to do is go ahead and take those off in order to exaggerate the effect. If we were going a little bit faster, say 120, 130 miles per hour, we'd have a much more dramatic impact with this oversteer. But right now it's handling pretty well. Let's pop those spoilers off and see what happens. Boink and boink. All right, watch this. Okay, now we've taken away downforce, but we're still fairly stiff, so you're going to have a little bit less traction because, again, we're not really working the suspension. We're also getting those nice bumpies, which you can see right there. Whoa! Okay, there's the oversteer. So the reason the vehicle is oversteering now is because the front two tires are over tractioning the back two tires, which can actually be very desirable, especially if you're making some kind of drift car. Now, had we done the opposite and made the back wheels had more traction than the front wheels, you have a very, very different kind of effect, and you get very, very bad understeer. You can exaggerate this as much as you want. You can actually set the sideways friction on the back tires very low and basically pretend that you have your hand brake pressed or something like that. But again, not too bad at this point. Okay, so now like I said a minute ago, what about those of you guys who are working on a keyboard versus a controller? Well, let me show you where to play with that. People with controllers or wheels are going to have far more control in their vehicle. So as a result, I would suggest increasing the steer coefficient to give you more control. Now, if you took a look at our chart earlier, unfortunately I closed it, the higher the angle of the wheel, the angle of the wheel being greater than the angle of the vehicle turning, if you go past a certain point, then you actually lose traction. So right now, because my wheels go 18 degrees, unless I'm going very, very slow, I'm actually skidding almost all the time. With a controller, you can turn the wheel just 1 or 2 degrees, which will give you perfect handling. So what you're going to have to do is, if you're using a keyboard, you're going to have to find a trade-off between making this value too high, where you lose traction, and too low, where you don't have enough of that initial steer in for very low speed operations. Generally, you have to match that coefficient to the particular speed. If you're under controller on the flip side, I recommend setting this value to 30 and basically leaving it there at all times. Okay, so that's all done. What about those of you who like Need for Speed? Well, if you're that kind of person, then after putting the spring back on and getting that all ready to go once again, what you can do is you can always come over here to sideways friction and change this value up to its maximum. Again, what I would do for the back tires is I'd probably leave them somewhere around 4.5, and somewhere in the front tires, I give them slightly more traction. So now when you do this, theoretically, you get the absolute maximum amount of traction, especially if we put the spoiler back on in a minute. Let's see what happens. I personally find this to be far too touchy, especially if you're on a keyboard like I am right now. But at the same token, some people absolutely have to have the maximum amount of traction. Now, if we were to swap our suspension out and go back with the soft suspension that we had earlier, you'd find that you'd have a much easier time of getting traction. Whoa. Okay, so basically right now it feels like I'm driving on ice, or not on ice, rather, driving on rails because of just how stiff everything is. Because our suspension is so stiff and because our sideways traction is so high, it's going to be a much, much more exaggerated kind of effect right now. Whoa, whoa. I'd hate to try this on a Hero Highway, but we'll do that in just a second. Okay, now let's go for the ultimate. So you figured all this stuff out, you have a fairly good idea. I'm actually going to restore those values to what I feel that they should be. Now, what about that big scary spreadsheet I had earlier? Let's go take another look at that. So what I did is on the right-hand side, if you guys can see, is I've already calculated the weight bias. Then you can go ahead and calculate the stiffness bias as well. Theoretically, the springs should be as stiff as the weight that is on top of them. So at the moment, if I wanted to perfectly balance this out, all I would have to do is take this and multiply that by this particular value here to go ahead and get me which one I want. So if, for example, if this is the current for the average, which would be the middle, I'll simply multiply that by the difference between this and half. So since this is 0.56, I just take 1 over this. And there, ooh, I'm embarrassing myself here. Sorry. Take this, multiply that by 1.064 in this case. And there we go. We would have a suspension in the front of 3019, 0.9104, and then in the back, we'd do the opposite. We'd say 0.44, I'm sorry, not 0.44, 0.94. There we go. 0.94 multiplied by this. And that would be basically what our suspension would be. It would be slightly stronger in the front, slightly weaker in the rear. You can also see that bias over here. Now, if you wanted to, you could actually calculate your weight bias, calculate your spring bias, calculate your traction bias, calculate your downforce bias, and that would give you your total bias. As of right this second, we set this back to 2.4. We have a 59% forward bias, which would mean that we have a tendency to oversteer. So now, given all these cool variables right now, let's actually play with this real fast. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to soften the back springs. We'll go ahead and use our average value this time. That's a little bit too much. Let's go with 18th. Let's leave those alone. Let's actually soften the front. 57, 51. A little too much. Let's try 14,500. Oops, still slightly too much. 14,750. There we go. So now if we were to set our front springs to 14,750, our back springs to 17,422, theoretically, if you were to multiply everything together, that would give you a total traction bias of 50%, which is considered perfect handling for a particular given vehicle. Obviously, I like to set this slightly forward so I have a little bit of oversteer to help me steer. But let's go ahead and try this and see what happens. So we're going to take these guys and set these to 14,750. We're going to set our damping to 20% of that. Whoops. 2950. And we're going to set our back two tires to 17,422 with a damping of 3,484. We're also going to set our back tires to having 2.4 sideways friction and leaving our front two tires at 2.5, giving us a 50-50 traction bias. Word of warning. The traction bias is only good if you are not accelerating or decelerating, because when you accelerate, your weight is going to shift backwards onto the back tires. When you decelerate, it's going to dive on your front tires. So let's see what happens this time. And you'll see what happens when you do things mathematically as opposed to kind of by feel. So this is an average stiffness suspension. You'll notice I'm getting an ever so slight gentle tendency to kind of wander to the right. Go ahead and come to the right a little bit. But the other thing you're going to notice is how incredibly smooth the vehicle transfers weight between one side and the other, between accelerating and decelerating. There is a slight tendency to oversteer. Whoop! That's exactly how that would happen in the real world also if you hit a bump doing 110 kilometers an hour. But you'll forgive me. Whoops, I don't want to be in the back seat. I want to be in the front seat. Fine, be that way. That, by the way, is a function of stiffness, not the bias. But anyway, like I was saying, since we have a nice 50-50 balance between the front and back as far as traction, theoretically when not accelerating, keyword when not accelerating, that gives us a very, very, very smooth handling vehicle that's very, very predictable to given inputs. Go ahead and accelerate a little bit. Again, I'm not using 5 as my sideways friction here, and I still have a very, very easy to control vehicle. Keep in mind on sand, you have a pretty severe penalty as far as traction goes. That's just kind of a consequence of driving around on sand, but at the same token, you know, it makes it kind of fun. What you saw back there just a second ago when it hit the brakes and then easily went back on the power is nothing wandered around. It was very, very smooth. Should I be using a controller, I'd have even more control of this vehicle at this time. Let's go ahead and bring this over to Hero Highway and kind of see what happens. Let's see here. Hero Highway. We don't want Flatland. We want Hero. There we go. That works up. Works for me. There we go. Now on grass, of course, you have very little traction. That's my nice little burnout right there. Slow down just a little bit. Climb onto the road. And let's do this. Now you'll notice, oh, whoa, gotta be very careful here. Notice how easily, by the way, it got itself out of that little mess it was just in just a second. You have to slow down for these two bumps because otherwise you tend to go flying. But those of you guys familiar with this program are probably pretty familiar with this as well. Getting a little bit of oversteer, but that doesn't surprise me. Oh no! Went far too fast into that corner. Now some of you are like, well, in this game I can go this fast in this corner and this and whip around there, and real race cars could do this. No, they can't. It's a common misconception, but racetracks are actually pretty flat and pretty even. And even the most professional and scary ones are, you're not going as fast as you think. But anyway, let's continue. So you'll notice, now that I'm at very, very high speeds here, that it's very easy for the vehicle to kind of just drift just a teeny tiny bit. But it's also possible to grab that and go ahead and continue steering in exactly the direction I want. To get on the brakes in a second here. Oh, I did it too late. Typical. Okay, let's get ourselves back onto the track here. And let's continue. But notice how gently the vehicle transfers its weight from one side to the other. Notice how easily and not unstable it flies out of individual corners. Now, if I were smart, I'd be driving with a controller and I'd have even more control. Whoa! Spun out a little bit there, but that's just from something from earlier. Now, let's go ahead and put everything we just did together and add that downforce back in and see what happens. Go back to that last project, run back to my calculator. So this time I'm going to go ahead and set my stiffness in the rear to the hard, 556. Then I'm going to go ahead and set this in the front. What is it going to be, 86% or something like that? 40,000. Oh, 40,000. We're a little too far forward. 42,000. Way too much, 38,000. Let's go to 37,000. Bingo. So our front suspension is going to be 37,000. With a damping of 7,400. Our back suspension is going to be 43,556. Whoops. 43,556 with a damping of 8711. And the next thing we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and return our lovely little spoilers. The Oversteer. Go ahead and slap one on the front. Go ahead and slap one on the back. Now, theoretically, if we've done everything correctly today, we should have a pretty spectacularly handling vehicle. Again, keeping in mind that this thing's configured to be a race car driven with a controller as opposed to with a keyboard. I can always reduce the steering angle in the front in order to make that a little bit more manageable as well, should I want to. All right, let's go ahead and try this out and see what happens. Okay, here we go. Now, as the vehicle starts to go faster, keep in mind that I have a fairly even aerodynamic balance here, so it's just going to be basically reinforcing my low-speed handling properties. Now, if I went with a softer suspension, which would happen is, you would find that this thing is bottoming out a lot, just having a good amount of trouble. Notice that the vehicle does not like to leave the ground, but at the same token is we're not bottoming out, so it's not unbalancing or unsettling the vehicle. Go ahead and gently take this turn far too fast. Oh, much too fast. We really need to get some chevrons or something to give you a heads up on some of these corners. But at the very least, you're able to see kind of what's happening. Now, because I have all this extra traction because of that downforce and the fact I'm not traveling as fast, the vehicle almost looks like it's riding on rails, even though I'm not using those high sideways traction coefficients. So anyway, I hope this has all been informative to you and given you guys some inspiration to kind of approach your own problems. Remember that your suspension is only as good as your weight distribution, in that you don't necessarily need to use excessively high values for sideways traction if you're just trying to make a vehicle that handles well. Another thing you want to avoid is making your vehicle having too stiff of springs, because then it just gets very, very touchy. That is, unless, of course, you're using rocket boosters to hold you down to the ground, in which case, why not? That could actually be pretty helpful, because you need your springs to compress to actually start working. Thank you, and hope you guys enjoyed.